The world has been fed the story that China is a nation of 1.4 billion strong, the biggest population on Earth. It is a number that's been drilled into our heads by countless headlines and CCP propaganda. But today I'm going to pull back the red curtain and show you evidence that the Chinese Communist Party has been lying about its population all along. The real number might be hundreds of millions smaller, possibly as low as 900 million. Yes, you heard that right. China might have 500 million fewer people than they claim. And the implications of this monumental lie are terrifying for the CCP and the future of China. Before you dismiss this as some wild conspiracy, stick with me. In this video, I'm going to lay out exactly how I arrived at that 900 million figure through logic, data, including CCP's own dubious data, and a bit of personal insight. By the end, you'll understand why China's population number is likely just another big scam, and how it spells disaster for China's economy and the CCP's grip on power. So grab a seat. This isn't just a rant, it is a reality check on one of the biggest lies of the 21st century. Let's dive in. We have all heard the official story. China has 1.4 billion people. The CCP touts this at every opportunity. It is part of their image as an unstoppable giant, a market of limitless consumers, a workforce of endless labor. It is the reason foreign companies salivate at selling to China and why politicians tiptoe around the will of 1.4 billion Chinese. The number is central to China's perceived power. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That number is fake. It is a product of systemic data manipulation, political incentives, and decades of demographic tampering by the Chinese Communist Party. The more I looked into it, the more the inconsistencies piled up. I remember the moment I started questioning it. A few years ago, when I was still in China, I was talking to a friend who works in the field of demographics, and we were looking at population growth figures, and something just didn't make sense. China's population supposedly grew by about 300 million people between 1990 and 2020, despite the one-child policy and some of the lowest birth rates in the world. Meanwhile, India, which had a much higher birth rate, grew by roughly the same number of people in that period. How on earth could China, with all its draconian birth limits, right, keep pace with India, which had no such policy? I initially thought, no way, the Chinese government wouldn't lie about something as fundamental as population, would they? Well, the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Not only would they absolutely did. And the lie has gotten so big that even Beijing cannot keep it straight anymore. Let's start with the basic math, because the math never lies, unlike the CCP. If there's one thing you take away from this video, it should be this. China's population growth numbers make no logical sense. Not when you consider China's fertility rates and lack of immigration. Let's break it down in simple terms. First, the one-child policy era from 1979 to 2015. China enforced the notorious one-child policy. Urban families could generally have only one child. Rural families, maybe two, if the first was a girl. The policy was brutally effective at slashing birth rates, okay? And by the 1990s, Chinese women were officially having on average around 1.5 children each, well below the replacement rate of 2.1 needed to keep a population steady. Many experts believe the real number was even lower, possibly near 1.0 in some years, because local officials often, over-reported births. More on that later. Second, low fertility equals shrinking population. Basic demographics 101. If each generation is having only 1.5 kids per couple, the population should shrink over time. Fewer babies, more funerals means population decline. Some countries like Japan, with similarly low fertility, are already shrinking. Lastly, there's no immigration safety valve. Unlike Western countries, China doesn't have mass immigration to boost its numbers. Virtually no one wants to move to China, to live permanently. In fact, more people are trying to get out of China. So no help there. Now, given these factors, you would expect that China's population would have peaked around the 1990s or 2000s and then just started falling. But what do the official figures say? They claim China grew from about 1.1 billion in 1990 to 1.4 billion by 2020. That is an increase of roughly 300 million people, nearly the entire population of the United States added in the last 30 years. All this during the strictest anti-baby policy in human history and no significant immigration. Does that sound remotely plausible? It doesn't. Not unless the CCP found a way to conjure humans out of thin air. Let me put it another way. The math simply doesn't add up. To illustrate this, let's do a simplified thought experiment. So bear with me, it will be quick and eye-opening. Let's start with China's population in 1990, which is roughly 1.1 billion people, as they claimed. Now, apply China's own official fertility rates year by year and assume death rates as per their data. If we trust their reported average fertility, which is 1.5 also over a 30-year span, the population in 2020 should not be 1.4 billion. In fact, one analysis did this exact calculation and found that using the average fertility rate of 1.5 from 1990 to 2020, China's population would have dropped to around 890 million by 2020, not increased to 1.4 billion. 890 million. That is already a shockingly low number, and it's using China's own fertility stats, which might themselves be overstated. When the same method was applied to India, using India's higher fertility rates, the projected population for 2020 came out very close to India's actual reported number. In other words, India's growth makes sense, China's doesn't. Think about it. India in 1990 had about 860 million people and a high fertility rate, around 3 plus kids per woman. India grew to 1.38 billion by 2020, a gain of 520 million, which makes sense with their higher birth rate. China in 1990 had 1.1 billion and a much lower fertility, right? 1.5 kids per woman, and supposedly grew to 1.4 billion. a gain of 300 million. How did China even gain that many when each family was having half as many kids as Indian families? It's like saying two couples, one following strict diet portions, and the other just binge eating all the time. And somehow both gain the same amount of weight. It just defies logic. Even if someone argues population momentum, the idea that a previously young generation can keep growing for a few decades due to just pure inertia, that effect only goes so far. By the 2010s, any momentum from pre-one-child policy days should have just fizzled out. China's birth numbers officially kept falling throughout the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Yet magically, the total population kept rising. It is as if the books were being cooked. Spoiler, they were. And here's another smoking gun. The Chinese government itself used to brag that the one-child policy prevented 400 million births. They touted this as an achievement. Now, if that's true, how on earth did they still register a 300 million increase in population? Prevent 400 million births, yet still grow by 300 million? The only way both could be true is if either their propaganda about preventing births as a result of one-child policy is false, or the population figures are false. Or most likely, a bit of both. Something just stinks in the numbers. Let me simplify the takeaway of this whole rant in just one blunt statement. By all reasonable demographic calculations, China's true population should be far less than the official 1.4 billion, possibly on the order of 900 million to 1.1 billion at most, even before recent events like COVID-19, which we will get to. And guess what? There are plenty of clues pointing in that direction. So how could China get away with lying about something as huge as the number of people in the country? It's not like hiding a few extra dollars on a balance sheet. We're talking about hundreds of millions of just phantom people. The answer: systemic data fudging at multiple levels. Let's start with local government incentives. More people equals more money. In China, local officials have had strong incentives to inflate population figures for decades. Why? Because Beijing allocates funding for education, healthcare, welfare, etc. based on how many people live in each jurisdiction. So more reported residents equals more money from the central government. So what do you think happened? Every local bureaucrat knew that bumping up their population stats just a little bit could secure extra budget or avoid cuts. It's basically free money for them. All they have to do is just pencil in some phantom residents or avoid, taking the ghost names off the ledger. It's not even secret. This has been openly acknowledged in China. Even Chinese demographers have admitted that population data is often inflated by local governments to grab larger fiscal transfers. Now, if every province is juicing the numbers slightly, by the time you add it all up at a national level, you get a massively bloated figure. There are countless anecdotal reports of ghost residents, people who died but remained on household registries because families might not report the deaths to keep receiving the pensions, for example. Or people just counted in multiple places. For example, someone from a village moves to a city for work. The village might still count them as a resident to avoid showing population loss and keep the funds, right, from the central government coming. While the city also counts them as a new migrant in their census. So one real person counted twice in the national stats. Multiply that by millions of migrant workers, and you see the problem. China has seen one of the largest rural to urban migration in history over the past 40 years. Villages emptied out as young folks just went to the cities. Did the village officials always faithfully remove those people from their population rolls? Not a chance. Why would they? When keeping them on paper meant maintaining local funding and importance. So lots of double counting likely occurred between origin and destination locales. Perhaps even more damning is how birth figures themselves have been manipulated for political reasons. A shocking example is in 2016, after the one-child policy was relaxed to a two-child policy, the National Health and Family Planning Commission proudly announced that births skyrocketed to 18.8 million, a 10% jump from 2015. They hailed it as proof that the new policy worked. Look, more people are having babies now. And provinces like Shandong reported a 55% increase in births. Zhejiang claimed a ridiculous 75% increase. It was propaganda gold for officials who wanted to show they delivered a baby boom. But one problem, it was all fiction. Hospitals and vaccination records told a different story. The number of newborn vaccination doses barely budged in 2016. School enrollment later on, when those supposed babies reached school age, actually declined. In reality, demographers estimate China probably had only 13 million births in 2016, not 18.8 million. So what happened to those 5 extra million babies? They were simply made up on paper by bureaucrats under pressure to hit targets and please their bosses in Beijing. Think about that. If they can lie, blatantly about 1 year's birth, inflating maybe by 30 to 40%, then the cumulative population figures, which depends on adding up births every year, is definitely off. They have been inflating birth numbers for years to mask the collapse in fertility. Every time reality looked worse than the plan, someone massaged the data. Over decades, those phantom births at tens of millions of people who don't actually exist. Now, let's look at the census shenanigans. China does a census every 10 years in theory and estimates in between. The last one was in 2020, which was conveniently delayed and shrouded in unusual secrecy before the results were released. Many observers suspected that the delay was because the real data was showing a much lower population or even a population decline, which would be politically embarrassing because Xi Jinping was in the middle of crowning himself for another term, right? Can't have bad news. In the end, the official 2020 census data came out at 1.411 billion, just slightly above the previous estimate. Basically too neat to be believable. There are reports that some numbers were adjusted last minute to ensure China didn't show a population peak before India. China's leaders desperately wanted to still appear larger than India for as long as possible. They see it as a prestige thing. Funny enough, despite this official narrative, multiple experts, including a prominent Chinese demographer, Yi Fuxian, argued that by 2018, China's actual population was probably closer to 1.3 billion, not the neatly 1.4 billion claimed at the time. That's over 100 million people missing from the official count, even before those, moderate estimates. According to his analysis, China's population numbers are almost certainly inflated. So we have local officials fudging data, national agencies exaggerating births, and perhaps undercounting deaths, and political incentives to keep the big number inflated. Over 30 to 40 years, those lies compound. The craziest part? The data is so muddled and manipulated that likely not even China's top leadership truly knows the real population anymore. When you build a house of cards of fake data, eventually you don't even have a solid ground truth. The CCP has essentially been lying to itself. They're flying blind into their demographic future. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, all right, the stats are fishy, but can we see it on the ground? If tens or hundreds of millions of people are missing, is there visible evidence in China itself? Oh boy, there is. Let's talk about the eerie phenomenon of empty cities and villages. Welcome to the People's Republic of Ghosts. If China really had 1.4 billion people, you would expect every city to be teeming with life and every town brimming with residents. Instead, what do we see? Ghost cities, empty apartments, deserted villages. This is perhaps the most tangible evidence that China's population isn't what it's cracked up to be. Over the past decade, you might have seen news pieces or YouTube videos about China's famous ghost cities, right? Sprawling new urban developments with skyscrapers, malls, and highways, but hardly any people. I have personally driven through some of these areas. It is just absolutely surreal. High-rise apartment blocks as far as eyes can see, but at night, only just like a handful of lights are on. You could literally lie down in the middle of some 8-lane boulevards in broad daylight and not worry about being run over by automobiles because there's just no traffic. It's like a post-apocalyptic movie set, except it's brand new. Why do these ghost cities exist? The official explanation is often that they are built for the future, that people will eventually move in. Another explanation is that they are the product of a real estate bubble and speculative local government building, which is partially true. But here's a thought. Maybe there just aren't enough people to fill them now or ever. China built megacities expecting its population and urbanization to just keep booming. But if the people aren't there, you end up with entire districts vacant. And it's not just a few quirky ghost towns. There are dozens of largely empty new cities across China. Estimates say 65 million empty apartments exist, enough housing to accommodate the population of France, sitting vacant. Think about that. In a country where housing is supposedly in demand, they have an entire front's worth of homes empty. Either the planning was just insanely bad, or the demographic assumptions were just way off. They built it, but the people never came. Why? Because perhaps they never existed, or because the population has already declined, and everyone who has left, who is left, has either a home or have migrated elsewhere. Now, pair the ghost cities with what's happening in the countryside. Villages are dying out. This is well documented. Young folks left for the cities, leaving only the elderly behind in rural areas. And as the elderly die off, many villages literally become abandoned. A recent count suggested that China has upwards of 1.7 million empty villages. You heard that right. 1.7 million villages with basically no one living in them. That is an astonishing figure. Every day, on average, dozens of villages effectively vanish from the map as their last resident passes away or move out. Sure, one could argue that those people moved to cities and are counted in city populations, but it's clear the total rural population has collapsed. Did the total urban population grow enough to completely offset that? Possibly not. If the overall population is actually smaller. There are entire regions in China's northeast and interior that have seen massive population drops. Some provinces have been reporting net population loss for years, even by official data. Dongbei, Liaoning, Jilin, Heilongjiang, the Rust Belt provinces, are shrinking as industries die and people either leave or don't have kids. So how is the nation as a whole still supposedly growing? It can't be, unless, you juggle and cook the book. Let me share a quick personal anecdote that really drove this home for me. On a trip to a rural part of China, a while back, I walked through a village that, according to a local official, used to have about 500 residents. On that day, I could count the number of people I saw just with one hand. 3 old ladies and a barking dog. That was it. House after house was just empty. It really creeped me out. Or just completely crumbling. And I asked the official, where did everyone go? The answer? The young went to the cities for work and never came back. The old died. And the official still claimed hundreds lived there on paper, because a lot of families never bothered to officially deregister from the village. So officially, maybe it's 300 people, but actually, there might have been just 10. This is happening all over China's countryside. Millions of people that exist on paper are simply gone in reality. Even in cities, I have been to supposedly big cities in China that felt just utterly unclouded. Not Beijing or Shanghai, but third-tier cities with purported populations of several million. And yet, the streets and shops seemed quiet. Public transport not jam-packed. Plenty of elbow room. At first, I thought maybe it was just, less dense development. But now I wonder, were those cities' population stats exaggerated too? It wouldn't surprise me at all. Chinese social media, when censor allows it, sometimes bubbles with, videos of empty streets, deserted shopping malls, and idle factories, often with captions like, "Where's everyone?" Now, post 2020, some might say COVID lockdowns caused emptiness. But many of these observations predate COVID, or they are in places without lockdowns at the time. It's just as if like a chunk of the population just vanished. Some analysts have even suggested using satellite imagery of nighttime lights to estimate population distribution. The gist of it, some Chinese cities have far fewer lights on at night than you would expect if, say, 1 million people live there. Another clue that something is off. All these ghostly emptiness signs point to one thing. China's population has likely been grossly overestimated. The people they planned for, built cities for, and bragged about, they aren't actually there. So we've exposed the fake math, the ghost villages, the double-counted migrants, and the absurd birth data. It is clear China's real population might be hundreds of millions smaller than the official story. But the biggest cracks in the CCP's lie didn't come from old census spreadsheets. They came from something much darker. When COVID-19 hit China, the lie started to unravel. What the CCP tried to hide under lockdowns and censorship is now bleeding into public view. The crematorians couldn't keep up. Entire cities fell silent, not from quarantine, but from deaths. In part 2, dropping tomorrow, we will expose how COVID shattered the illusion and why this lie about population might be the final nail in China's future.